Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Point of Insanity Game Studios Geekery and General Podcast. And not too long ago, talked about Final Fantasy Record Keeper, and we're going to continue talking about that game again, because one of the things that made me think about this topic, and actually I've thought about this for a while, during the last major update, they introduced a new mode similar to the story mode, where this one it plays a little bit more like a traditional Final Fantasy game where you have a map you get to explore, though again it's still very rudimentary. But during one of the cutscenes there, again where Tyro and Alara are exploring these paintings, Dr. Mogg warns that they might be messing with history. So I thought it might be fun to speculate. What if all the Final Fantasy games, the main ones, were intended to take place on the same planet in the same continuity? What would the most logical chronological order be? Now, obviously, Square didn't intend for the games to have any direct relationships with each other, with the exception of their spin-offs or sequels like, Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy IV The After Years, and of course, there's a gazillion games or spin-offs based off of 7, and then 10 and 13 have their sequels as well, and Tactics does too, and I think 12 also had a spin-off. So this is just a theory. Now, to help me discuss this topic, I've got my son with me, Alan. How you doing today, Alan?
Good.
Now, between the two of us, we've only played some of the games, so a lot of the knowledge comes from Record Keeper, as well as reading various plot synopsises on various wiki sites or watching the occasional YouTube video. Now, first, let's talk about the games we've actually played quite a bit into. For me, I've played 1, 2, 4, 4 The After Years, 6, the first of the 13 games, 15, Type 0, and Mystic Quest. I personally hope that they do introduce Mystic Quest later on in Record Keeper, but I am going to include it because I do have an idea on how it could be worked into the timeline. So what are some of the games that you've played in the series?
So the games I've played is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 15.
Yep, so again, not all of these games we've necessarily played through to completion. I'm still working on Type 0. I haven't...
And I'm still working on, 3 and 7. I'm trying just to enjoy the games as much as I can, unlike Dad's playthrough of 15, where he sort of just rushed through the game.
Hey, by the time I beat that game for the first time, I had 88 or 89 hours in there, so I didn't rush through it. It's a big game, I know. I like to explore a game and really, get as much out of it as I can. I mean, especially when you get a game and you've just paid $60, $70 for it. Yeah, you want to get as much out of it as you can.
Yeah.
So one of the first problems we run into when we try to discuss how all these games would fit into the same timeline on the same planet is how the world maps change. And honestly, I don't think this is really too much of an issue. Well, the Earth, we know, is divided into several plates, and because of geologic activity, they've shifted around over the course of billions of years. And you look at a world map, for example, you can see that it looks like, obviously Africa and South America look like they fit together rather nicely, and there's a few other parts where you can kind of see how things could fit together as a nice little jigsaw puzzle. And so again, we know that the plates have moved over the course of the planet's history. So that could also explain why, some of these civilizations may have had no knowledge of each other. They could have been so isolated. For example, the Romans, they knew of the Greeks and the Egyptians and a few other civilizations, but they would have had no way to know of the civilizations that sprung on North and South America. Also, another interesting theory is that each world map in a Final Fantasy game could actually be just in a single part of the entire world. Now, what got me to think about that was a video I watched that showed how Spira from Final Fantasy X could fit in as a portion of the world map of Final Fantasy VII. And we're going to be talking about the connections between 7 and 10 later on. We also know that from Final Fantasy VI that there is magic that is capable of reshaping a planet. Plus, it's a fantasy game.
Mm-hmm.
It says so right there in the title.
Yep.
Suspend your disbelief, people. So, another possible issue is different names and terms, but we could just explain that as different, the same concepts being described in different languages. So when we were talking about how these games could all fit together, we thought a lot about some of the common elements that we see in the Final Fantasy series. So before we begin, one last thing. Spoiler alert, if you haven't played some of these games, there will be some spoilers in there. So, now one of the things that actually made it a lot easier to think about this topic is you had mentioned that we could divide it into 2 different periods.
Yep.
So what are those 2 periods?
The Crystal era and the post-Crystal era.
And what got you thinking about this idea? Because when we were talking, I actually thought it sounded like a really good idea.
Like, the Crystal era is that some games don't really focus on the crystals, while they're a major plot point.
Yep, because crystals or crystal-like objects are a common reoccurring device in, almost all of the Final Fantasy games. But in some of the earlier ones, there's this, they are more central to the plot.
Yeah.
And usually they represent different elements. So I thought that was actually a really good amount of thinking at your part.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back to the beginning. So what game do you think would probably be, chronologically, the first of the series?
Final Fantasy 1.
Okay. And why do you think that?
I think the reason why 1 would be first is that the game, it's quite primitive, and this is when the 4 crystals were introduced. Also, another thing is that currently the world is in chaos because of chaos. Because the world is stuck in a time loop. So, 4 Warriors of Light that they don't have exact names, so we're just going to call them Warriors of Light, go on their quest to defeat Garland and the Chaos.
See, and I'm going to disagree with you, because I was actually looking, when I was doing research on one of the games, Final Fantasy XI, which, again, is one of the games neither one of us have played, so again, we wouldn't really have had any way to know about this. I think that actually would be the best, most logical first game in the series. And let me tell you why. So in Final Fantasy XI's mythology, there is mention of a sentient crystal that created everything. So this is where some of these crystal legends could have started. And it also, early in this world's history, there was a technologically advanced, prosperous, utopian society. Now, during this time, the people started a war with the spirits, which included Bahamut, a character that we see in most of the Final Fantasy games in one way or another. And during this time, the people, this ancient advanced civilization, and I apologize, I forgot the name, they created a weapon that almost destroyed the world. So, do you remember the Lufenian society, Lufenia, that's mentioned in Final Fantasy 1?
Not that much.
Yeah, because it takes place later in the game. Because remember, the Warriors of Light, they go to that ancient, that isolated society where no one speaks the language. They only speak their own language, rather. So remember, they have to find the tablet so they can, they can communicate with these people. So I think that the reason I would put 11 first is because this technologically advanced society could be the forerunner for the society that we see in Final Fantasy 1. Also, Bahamut, after the events of that game, could have decided that it was necessary to make sure that heroes would always be able to rise to fight against evil. So that could be why he set up that, test of courage that would let you do the class change.
Mm-hmm.
So, in Final Fantasy 1, which again, both of us agree would fit in early on in the game. So, Chocobos and Moogles don't appear in this one, so we were thinking that maybe they were extinct by this time. Possibly Garland or the Fiends could have tried to wipe them out.
As they do often help the heroes.
Yes, and plus Chocobos are cute.
And Moogles.
Yes, and just remember the words of Prompto from Final Fantasy 15. There is no wrong way to love a Chocobo.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take that out of context. But anyways, so we know one of the key elements in this game is that the Warriors of Light defeat Chaos, and they break this time loop, which is something that we actually will see in a couple of the other games that make it, actually kind of logical. And when they broke this time loop, that could have erased the event that caused them to go extinct. Though we were also discussing that it's possible maybe Chocobos and Moogles weren't exactly extinct, but they were just very rare.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, I think the next game that would be logical would be Mystic Quest, which I believe you haven't played it yet.
I have seen it.
Yeah, you've seen me play it, and I know it hasn't been touched on in Record Keeper. Square, Dina, if you're listening, please introduce a realm for Final Fantasy Mystic Quest.
It could be put in Beyond.
Yeah, because I know they introduced that Beyond section, which is the stuff that doesn't fit into the main ones. Oh, yes, and also I know there's a lot of games that we're going to be leaving out in this discussion, like the Final Fantasy Dimensions series, and then there were some of the Legend and series that were made for the Game Boy Advance and not Game Boy Advance, for the Game Boy. And then, of course, there's we also might think, well, what about other games? Like, for example, Final Fantasy characters appear in Kingdom Hearts. So there's, how would Kingdom Hearts fit into all this?
Well, that depends, like what Final Fantasy characters do appear in Kingdom Hearts.
I know that Cloud and Riku both appear in Kingdom Hearts, and I think there's others as well.
I remember Sid and Yuffie.
Okay, I didn't know that they appeared in Kingdom Hearts. I haven't played any of the Kingdom Hearts games, so I just know that some of the games some of those characters have crossed over into Kingdom Hearts. But like I said, we're not really going to be discussing those games. We're just discussing the main ones. Now, one of the reasons I think we could work Mystic Quest in there is because Mystic Quest could take place after Final Fantasy I, because both of them share a similar characteristic. You've got something in the middle of the world, and in the first Final Fantasy game...
That was the Shrine of Chaos.
Correct, the Shrine of Chaos. And later in the game, when you're in the Tiamat's dungeon, which in the original version is a satellite, and in the later versions they just have it like a castle in the sky. But there's a portal you can look through, and it notices that you see all the energy from the four elements flowing into the shrine at the center of the world. Now in Mystic Quest, there is the focus tower at the center of the world, and I think that in a theory, maybe after the Warriors of Light destroyed the chaos and the Shrine of Chaos collapsed, that maybe someone could have built the focus tower on, because as I recall in that stories in the instruction manual for Mystic Quest, they do mention that there was once a time where there was prosperity and communication between the different nations. And again, we do see the different elements each being drained, or the crystals rather, being drained of their power by some powerful monster. So after 1, we actually thought the next one that would make chronological sense would be 3. And you actually had this idea. So why do you think Final Fantasy 3 would be the next logical step in this progression?
Well, another thing you need to know about 3 is the characters, as they're way different. In the original NES version, you play as all Onion Knights, so you're basically just more generic Warriors of Light. But in the 3D versions, you play as Luneth and friends.
Okay, so do you think that you were saying that you think the version with Luneth and friends, when the Warriors of Light were given distinct names and personalities, that's the one that we should consider canon?
Well, yeah, the reason why is it's just, as overall, it just feels more natural, and another thing that I also think really like the games are connected is that the crystals speak of the past Warriors of Light, and also another reason is that the Wind Crystal grants all the 6 jobs that the Warriors of Light started off with.
Right, and I think you were mentioning that in the original version you didn't get Thief right away.
Yeah, which I don't like this. I believe the crystal that you save first is the Wind Crystal, which was the last crystal you saved in the Game Boy Advance version. So, after this, I feel like that why wouldn't the crystals entrust Thief onto them right away, considering that if there was a thief in the original Final Fantasy, it did serve them well, so why wouldn't they give them thief right away?
Yeah, and I thought that was a good idea because, you know, you mentioned the other jobs, you know, warrior, black belt, or monk, white mage, black mage, red mage, you know, and thief, they're all, you know, the original ones from Final Fantasy 1 were all available really early on in Final Fantasy 3.
Yeah, but if you were playing the NES version, you would only be able to get these jobs until, like, the second crystal, where you actually get Thief. And also, hashtag Thief's mustache.
Yes, I know Pro Jared had a video where he was talking about how the Thief, you know, had the mustache of a science teacher or a math teacher or something like that. But next, 5. You actually came up with another idea as why you thought it would be better to go after 3, go to 5, and then 4. So why don't you explain what you told me about why you think 5 would be the next logical step?
So, in 5, if they speak of the legends of the past warriors. It seems like during the time in between in 3 and 5, there was a big battle against X-Death, and they used the crystals to seal. But another thing is that there's a Dark Realm in 5 that could also possibly be based off of the Dark Realm Cloud of Darkness was in. Another thing is that the crystals do give all the jobs, though oddly, Warrior is taken up by Knight, which, to be honest, Warrior was just better as a Knight to begin with. And then but instead of Red Mage, there was Blue Mage, but you get Red Mage still fairly early on.
Okay. And I thought that was a good, listen, I think you had a good idea there. I've played a very, very, very little bit of 5. I think I played to, shortly after you encounter... Well, I think I got to the part where you first met up with Ferris and the pirates.
Actually, I was continuing that file.
Okay, so you started my file and you just kept going on.
Yeah.
Okay, hey, whatever works, so...
And I'm already at the part where I'm supposed to be going after the fire crystal, but I'm actually somewhat just setting the grind.
Okay. So, next 4. And one of the reasons I think 4 would come next is because we do see some of the previous jobs appear. The Dark Knight, the Paladin, Dragoon, Ninja, Bard, Monk, Summoner... White Mage, Black Mage, and Sage, these all appeared in the previous games. So I think by this time in the world's history, the knowledge of how to take on these jobs could have been commonplace enough that people no longer needed crystals to give them this knowledge. And also I think that when from 4 on, it would make sense that technology would start to advance, because... we have to look to the ending of Final Fantasy IV, the After Years. In that game, at the end, because I think you've seen me beat that game, right?
I think I have.
Because you fight an entity at the end of that game called the Creator, and he mentions that his civilization became really advanced, and they weren't, but they eventually stagnated, and the civilization was destroyed, and he was the survivor. So he felt that the universe shouldn't be allowed to be overrun with inferior beings. So what he did is he created these crystals, and he seeded planets with them, and these crystals would act as depositories of knowledge. Now, at the end of the game, the heroes defeat the Creator, who was going to destroy the world that Final Fantasy IV takes place on, which... they always call just the Blue Planet. And so this allows the world to continue, and civilization can continue to advance. And I think it's also possible that since these crystals were intended to record the progress of a civilization, it's possible that these crystals that the heroes have access to now may still have that information from these previous civilizations.
Yeah, so that's why I think is like that all those efforts from the first Warrior Lights, the Second Coming, and the Third Coming, all of them gave help the crystals advance.
Yeah, and from this point on, we really don't hear much about the term Warriors of Light being advanced or being used. And also, if we look at the chronological order of the games as they were released, after 5, crystals start to play a significantly less role in the game. So that's so it was a little tricky thinking about what would come next. And honestly, I thought 9 would be the most logical progression. Because I think as far as like the technology level, it's pretty similar to what it would have been near the end of Final Fantasy IV. But the reason I think 9 should come next is because 2 of the characters in there, Garnet and Eiko. Now, do you remember one of the major plot points in Final Fantasy IV?
I do. That is, Rydia's one of the last summoners.
Right, because the Kingdom of Baron wanted to destroy the Village of Mist where the summoners lived. But as we know, eventually the village did rebuild, and it is still available as a location in Final Fantasy IV the After Years. But we find out in Final Fantasy IX that Garnet and Eiko are the last of the summoners, and they came from a village of summoners that was destroyed. So I think it's possible that Rydia did manage to reestablish the Village of Mist. It did start to prosper again until another power arose that was afraid of the powers of the summoners, so they were wiped out again. Now, as far as how crystals appear in Final Fantasy IX, for the most part, they reside at the center of the world, and they're the source of all the souls in the world. So that's where all souls come from and where all souls go back to.
The life stream?
Well, we're not quite to the part of the life stream yet. The concept of the life stream as we see in 7 is, at least the way I understand it, it's different than how these crystals appear in 9. I haven't played 9, so as I said, most of my knowledge of that game comes from either Record Keeper or just reading various wiki articles on it. So I thought the next game would be Final Fantasy XIV. Originally I was thinking, okay, this would probably be a little better suited towards the post-crystal era, but the reason I think that it would probably be better here is because in that game's mythology, there is the talk of something called the Mother Crystal, and that could be referring back to the same crystal from Final Fantasy XI. And the whole Realm Reborn concept, that I think could work quite well into something that we see happen in what I think is the next step, Type 0. Because in Type 0, and again, I haven't played too far into that game, so I had to spoil the ending of the game for myself, but in the game's introductory cutscene, you learn that there's 4 crystals in here. But instead of being symbolic of the elements like they were in a lot of the previous games, instead, they're symbols of knowledge, where the first is the Vermilion Bird Crystal, that symbolizes the power of magic. The White Tiger Crystal, that represents the power of weapons. The Azure Dragon Crystal represents the power of the dragon, which I understand as communication. And then finally, the Black Tortoise Crystal represents the power of the shield. Now, at the end of this game, the crystals are destroyed, but I think there's one that could have survived. And before we go into Final Fantasy XV, this is why I think that it makes sense to put this right after 14. Because at the end of Type 0, you learn about how the world has gone through different reboots, or these different cycles, where the world just gets wiped out and, starts over again. So I think the events that go from Final Fantasy XIV to Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, we could maybe interpret that as just another one of these reboots. Maybe just happening in a different part of the planet.
Yeah.
So this brings us to Final Fantasy XV, a game that both of us have played and enjoyed a lot of. So in this game, there's only one crystal, and I think that since there's just a single crystal here, we could see this as another version of the mother crystal mentioned in 14 and the crystal that created the world in 11. And as a result of the breaking of the time loop that happened in Type 0, this could be what caused the star scourge to appear. Basically, the star starts to lose its light, and that's where Noctis has to sacrifice himself in order to bring back the light. So this leads us into what we decided would be called the post-crystal era. So these games would be 2, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, and 13. So the era of the crystals came to an end after the end of 15, where I don't think they say anything about the crystal actually being destroyed. I think they imply that it still continues to exist. Yeah, it's just that we don't really hear in these next games. There's usually not as much emphasis on a crystal as a major plot point, at least from what we know of these games.
Yeah.
So we think that Final Fantasy II would be the good reboot point for the start of the post-crystal era. So why did you think that Final Fantasy II would make sense as this the starting point of the post-crystal?
One thing that's definitely apparent is the game's darker nature compared to the other Final Fantasy games. As one thing that happens in this, also it can be safe to say that that Moogles have gone extinct until 6, or whenever game is next. Because, when is the last game from Moogles that appeared in the Crystal Era?
Not sure if Moogles appeared in... Well, I know they appeared in Type 0. I don't know if they appeared in 14 or not.
There was some event between 15 and 14 that means that the Moogles possibly could have gone extinct, or have become very rare, or possibly during Type 0 if they don't appear and then it's until the next game in the timeline that has Moogles till they're brought back. Another reason why is that the world is pretty much destroyed still by the Empire, and I have the feeling that the Emperor is possibly a survivor of the Niflheim Empire, Imperial Army.
Yep, that's what we were both thinking, is that Emperor could be having dreams of restoring the Niflheim Empire, which led him to try to take over the world. And this would lead us into what we thought would be the next one. Because remember, at the end of 15, most of the world is in ruin.
Yeah.
Like Lestalem, and because you've played more into Comrades than I have.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other places that survived?
The only places that seem to have survived are Hammerhead, Lestalem, Old Lestalem, Meldatio Hunter HQ, Kothis Depot, Cape Kayam, Nodoshan Garrison, which has been turned into a base, and Insomnia.
Yeah, so there's still a few pockets of civilization, but for the most part, everything has been abandoned.
So, yeah, that's why I think the Emperor is trying to restore the Niflheim Empire.
Yeah, and again, we could see this as, one of the theories we have is that each of the world maps is just a single part of the world in general. So maybe Eos, where Final Fantasy 15 takes place, that was one continent, but the world map for where Final Fantasy 2 takes place, that could have just been another series of continents on the planet. So, moving on to 6, here is where we see technology start to come back. The world has more or less rebuilt itself, and we could see the Emperor of Gestalt. That could be perhaps another one of these empires that arose when the world was starting to rebuild itself. Also, the Moogles, the reason we may not have seen them in 2 is they could have moved underground. Because you might remember that in Final Fantasy VI, the Moogles live in a cave.
Yeah, so meaning that possibly the Moogles ended up migrating to wherever 6 took place. And also, Moogles are starting to become more aggressive as they're now able to start wielding spears and maces.
Yep, so they start to become, warriors again, and of course they have the dancing ability. Now, also at this time, we start to see Magitech devices. So this could be rediscovered technology from 14, 15, or Type 0, as Well, I know in Final Fantasy 15 we've got the Magitech troopers. Magitech I know is mentioned in Final Fantasy 14, and Type 0 I know, at least from what I've played of it so far, one of the characters has a Magitech pistol. So that could be rediscovered technology. Now, halfway through Final Fantasy 6, we see the world go from the world of balance to the world of ruin because of Kefka.
Wasn't that at like the 2/3 or midway point?
It's commonly accepted as kind of like the midway point, so somewhere around there. But yeah, we see the world go from the world of balance to the world of ruin. And this is why I think this is why I think it's most logical to put Final Fantasy VI here. Now, the next part of this history, I think, would be Final Fantasy Tactics. I think this could be seen as a period similar to the Middle Ages on Earth. Now, from what I was reading about some of the plot summaries for Tactics, the party does encounter evidence of past technologically advanced civilization. So this could be the remnants of some of the kingdoms that existed in Final Fantasy VI, the Kingdom of Figaro. Also, these could be remnants of things that Kefka destroyed as well. Another reason that I think Tactics would go well here, one of the key elements in Final Fantasy Tactics is there's a lot of political maneuvering in it, but there's also a religious conspiracy. And this is why I think it translates well into Final Fantasy X. Because in the world of ruin from Final Fantasy VI, as it started to recover, people came to distrust technology. So we learn about that in the start of Final Fantasy X. Now, even though Kefka destroyed the world with magic, I think people could have thought it was really just advanced technology. Now, we do know at the end of Final Fantasy VI, magic does leave the world, but somehow between that and Tactics, and then Tactics and 10, magic starts to return. Now, I remember I mentioned the religious conspiracies in Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, as I recall from one video, Game Theory, the host of that one, Matt Pat, he has an episode where he talks about how Final Fantasy games are anti-religion. It's a very good episode, very interesting. Highly recommend you go take a listen to it if you have a chance. And he mentions in there that there's a church in Final Fantasy Tactics that talks about resurrecting a saint named Saint Ajora, who was a demon. And after the events of that game, anyone that tries to expose this is killed. And that's why I think it would be a good lead into Final Fantasy X, because in this game, you've got a church called the Church of Yevon. So this whole religious conspiracy and this church that takes place in Final Fantasy Tactics could lead to the development of the Church of Yevon that we see in Final Fantasy X. Now, after the events of Final Fantasy X, I could see 12 being the next game. Because in this game, magic and technology are commonplace. So it would be a nice transition from 10 to 7. Also, one of the reasons... Well, now you had mentioned that you had heard about the theory that Final Fantasy X and 7 were connected.
Yeah.
So do you know anything about that theory, or is it just something you heard about?
I think it's something about, like, some people, like, were mentioning, like, Shinra, mostly about, like, the Shinra company.
Yeah, because in Final Fantasy X's sequel, Final Fantasy X2, the party meets a young boy named Shinra who says he's discovered the planet's life force, and he hopes that it can eventually be harnessed as a form of energy, though he admits that could take generations. And I think the mist from Final Fantasy XII could be a step in harnessing the planet's life force. So now we get to Final Fantasy VII, and why don't you take over a little bit, because you know a bit more about that game than I do.
And during the first moments of the game, we learn about what the Mako reactors are. What they're doing is they're basically taking the life stream and converting it into energy. Which, in other words, because this is the life stream, they're basically turning human souls into electricity.
Yes, because one of the videos that I was watching about the possible connection between 10 and 7, they mentioned both of them have a similar concept. It's in 7, it's called the Promised Land, and then in Final Fantasy X, it's called the Far Plane. And that's where the person who made that video I was watching was saying that they could be the people from different cultures using different languages trying to explain the same thing. Now, I know there's also ancient races in both of them.
Like Red 13 and Eris.
Yeah, because Eris belongs to the race of the Serta.
Cetra.
Do they really talk much about that about the Serta or explain?
The Cetra, it's more explained during about the time when you go to the Forgotten Capital, mostly around the time when it's like about when you go to the it's where you basically your party is trying to get the black materia, so they go to the Temple of the Ancients. And usually it's described from about the Temple of the Ancients to some time after Aerith's death.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure how the Fae work in Final Fantasy X. I think they're the souls of the people who used to live in one of these technologically advanced civilizations before it was destroyed by sin. I could be wrong on that. Like I said, most of my knowledge of 10 comes from Record Keeper. So I think the next step would be 8. By this time, the crystals don't really play that major a role in the story or the world's mythology. So I think by this time in history, they may have been forgotten about. Now, from what I can tell, from what I've seen of Final Fantasy VIII, it looks like the technology is about similar to 7, maybe a little bit more advanced. So I don't know. I suppose you could probably swap 7 and 8's position in the timeline, but I think that it would probably be best to put 8 after 7. Now, I don't know too much about 8, but it seems to me that one of the antagonistic forces in this world is the nation of Galbadia. And I think that if we try to work it into the last game, 13, Final Fantasy 13, they refer to something called the Transgression War. And I think that it's possible that maybe the remnants of Galbadia could have been responsible for this war, which would lead to the events of Final Fantasy 13. Now, Final Fantasy 13 seems to be the most technologically advanced of the post-Crystal era games. We've got 2 worlds in here, Cocoon and Grand Pulse. Now, Grand Pulse, as described in the game, at one time in its history, Grand Pulse was home to a thriving civilization and many great cities. Now it is home to many great ruins, and people are nowhere to be seen. The lower world, that stood in conflict with Cocoon, but traces of its culture exist only in ruins. Perhaps these ruins are the remains of the civilization from 8, and people use technology to convert the moon into a habitable living place that, like I said, they called Cocoon. Now, in this world, the crystals take the form of godlike beings called the Phallasy, and they use them to interact with mortals. And I don't know, because I know in Final Fantasy 13 they talk about focus and how if you don't complete this focus, you get turned into some kind of monster. But to end the cycle, in Final Fantasy 13 Part 3, at the end of the game, Lightning encounters a crystal that creates a new world. So perhaps this crystal could be seen as the crystal that created the world at the start of Final Fantasy 11. It might also be the same crystal that was the Mother Crystal in 14, and the same crystal as the one in Final Fantasy 15. And I think Final Fantasy 12, they also mention a great crystal in that one as well. So this new world that the crystal creates, that could be the world that Final Fantasy Record Keeper takes place in.
Yeah.
So there you have it. That's our little take on how Final Fantasy Record Keeper could serve as a way to link all of these worlds as a series of, of historical events that would have occurred on the same planet.
Yeah.
So, but hey, that's just a theory.
Let's not get copyrighted.
Okay, we're not gonna rip off Matt Pat in the game theory, but seriously, go watch Matt Pat's episode on Final Fantasy games and why they're anti-religion. It's actually very interesting and very thought-provoking. So, well, with that said, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and have a good evening. or morning, or afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are, and happy gaming. You have been listening to a program from the Point of Insanity Network. Visit us at poigamestudio.podbean.com for more shows. Follow us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at POI Game Studio.